The middle grade novel Max in the Land of Lies, A Tale of World War II, is a sequel to the New York Times bestseller Max in the House of Spies, and it's the continuing story of Max, a 12-year-old boy who serves as a British spy. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and welcome to the Kids Bookshelf. Ahead, we'll explore the book, and I'll talk with the author about the inspiration behind it. Adam Gidwitz is the best-selling author of numerous books for young readers, including the Newberry Honor winner, The Inquisitor's Tale, and the Unicorn Rescue Society series, among others. He joins us to talk about Max in the Land of Lies. Adam, welcome to the Kids Bookshelf.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be back. One of the things that I really loved about our conversation last time was, it was very in-depth. It was very serious. We really talked about the book in a thoughtful way. I was very grateful to you. So thrilled to be back talking to you again.
Well, glad to have you back as well. For those who didn't see that first interview I did with you, let's talk a little bit about Max and the inspiration for this character.
Yeah, so as a young person, there was a family friend of ours named Michael Steinberg. Michael was a music critic. He wrote a lot of concert notes. If you would go to a classical music concert, you would often read about the piece in the playbill or the program, and he would have written that. And so we spent a lot of time with Michael. And one of the things about Michael was he had this deep voice and a weird accent. I could never figure out where his accent was from. And he was a little bit intimidating. Though I did have one, I don't know if I told you last time, but I had this one really meaningful experience with Michael when I was a teenager. We were sitting at breakfast. He had stayed over the night. And at breakfast the next morning, the book, The Phantom Tollbooth, came up. And he had never heard of it. And so I took a risk and I ran up to my room and I got a copy of The Phantom Tollbooth and I put it in his hands because I loved that book. But I was very nervous because Michael Steinberg was a little bit famous and he had read every book and knew every piece of music. And I was like, who am I to tell Michael Steinberg what he should be reading? And he took the book and he went out into the backyard and he sat down in one of our chairs and he opened the book and he started to read it. And he sat there for like 4 or 5 hours without standing up. And then later that year, he sent a copy of The Phantom Tollbooth to all of his closest friends for the holidays, which was one of my proudest moments, really. But Michael, the reason I'm telling you about Michael is because when he was 10 years old, his mother put him on a train in Berlin, Germany, 1938. And the train took him to a ferry, and the ferry took him to England, a country he had never been to. He didn't know anybody. He had never met anyone there. And he was placed with a family there, and he lived there for 10 years, not knowing whether he would ever see his mother again. He was one of the lucky ones. His mother was able to escape Germany and eventually make her way to England. And that's the reason why he had that strange accent, is that he was like German for the first 10 years and then English, and then he came to the United States after that. So Michael's story, the story of a boy escaping Nazi Germany on what was called the Kindertransport, when 10,000 Jewish children were taken out of Nazi Germany and sent to England, but their parents weren't allowed to come with them. That story was something I knew I always wanted to write a book about. And finally, I found a way to do it in Max in the House of Spies. And now the sequel and conclusion to the duology, Max in the Land of Lies.
Now, Max is 12 years old, and he, like the person who inspired it, goes from Berlin to England, but he wants to go back to Berlin, and that's kind of where we end the first book. So I'm sure it would help to read that first book, but does the second book stand alone if you haven't read the first?
I think so. I think there's something satisfying in the end of the book that ties back to the beginning, to the first volume, that it would be helpful to read the first one. But it sets up quite clearly its own standalone story where Max is in Nazi Germany and the British spy masters who have let him come back have a mission for him, which is to infiltrate the Funkhaus. The Funkhaus was the center of Nazi propaganda and the radio broadcasting system through which most Nazi propaganda was distributed. Sort of what the internet is for us today, radio was for the Nazis. So that's his official mission. But Max has a secret mission, which is that he wants to find his parents and see if they're okay and if he can help them.
But he's been forbidden to do that. So if he does it, he's on his own.
That's exactly right. Yes, they told him it would be far too dangerous for him and for his parents should he try to find them. But one of the things that I was thinking a lot about as I was thinking about the original true story with Michael and then this story with Max that I wanted to write is, kids. Max is a genius. He's a genius with the radios. He thinks 4 steps ahead of everyone else, which is what allows him to be such a brilliant young spy in the first place. But he's still a kid, and kids have a lot of emotions that are not rational. I mean, we all do, but kids in particular have a lot of emotions that don't necessarily accord with reality. And just like as a kid who, let's say, lives through a parental separation may blame themselves, Max coming to England feels responsible for his parents being left behind, like he should try to help them, like he needs to do something about it. Especially because in my story, Max is always, again, thinking a few steps ahead. And so he was always the one keeping his parents, ahead of the Nazis who might be, trying to make their lives miserable. And so, he wants to go back and find them and help them.
And he is helped and sometimes hindered by these 2 immortal creatures that live on his shoulders. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah, so all of the books I write, I write some folklore-inspired fantasy, I write historical fiction, but always I have elements of folklore and mythology. At one point, my editor asked me, are you ever going to write a book that doesn't have a dragon in it? And my response was, why? Now, this book doesn't have a dragon in it, spoiler alert, but it does have these 2 mythical immortal creatures. So when Max leaves England in the first book, these 2 creatures appear on his shoulders. One is a kobold named Berg, and kobolds in German mythology are creatures who live in your house or where you work, and they make mischief, and they sort of make your life miserable. The other, on his other shoulder, is a Dybbuk named Stein. And in Jewish mythology, Dybbuks attach themselves to you and make your life miserable. So lucky for Max, he has them both. And they start with a lot of heckling of him. But over the course of the 2 books, their role and relationship with Max evolves.
I'm talking with Adam Gidwitz about Max in the Land of Lies, a tale of World War II, and our conversation will continue. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. The first book was a bestseller, and I'm wondering, why do you think kids identify with Max? Why do they find his story exciting and sort of, have some empathy for him?
It's a great question. I think that, Max is in some ways an extreme example of what every kid feels like. We launch kids into this world that is very confusing, where it's hard to tell who's your friend and who's not your friend. And I think, they head off to school or to summer camp or whatever away from their parents, and they have to fend for themselves. And that's what Max is doing, just on a much more extreme level. And so kids love books in which they get to emotionally inhabit a character who is going through things like they are, but in the cases of historical fiction or fantasy, much more extreme than what they actually go through, as a way of experiencing those things, rehearsing those things, processing those emotions, and ultimately gaining the confidence that, like Max, like the fictional character, they too will overcome what feels like insurmountable odds and triumph.
Now, you mentioned that the kobold and the Dybbuk sort of evolve over the course of these 2 books, but how do you think Max changes over those 2 books?
Well, I think Max learns a lot. One of the questions that I always asked myself as a child was, why? I would learn about the Holocaust and the Nazis, and I would wonder why. Why did they do this? And as a Jewish boy growing up, I would ask myself, why did they hate me so much? Or why would they have hated me so much? And so one of the questions that Max has as he returns to Nazi Germany is that same question, why? So he's got, his mission to infiltrate the Funkhaus. He's got his mission assigned by himself to find his parents. And then he's got a mission from me, the author, which is, why were they like this? Why did the Nazis do this? And so over the course of the second book, Max in the Land of Lies, he encounters lots of Germans, many Nazis, some not Nazis, and begins to understand why each one of them might be committed to this ideology of hate and to an ideology based entirely on big lies.
This is historical fiction. So there's a lot of research involved here. And obviously, you're referencing some things that happened in history. So tell us about some of the things that this book references that if someone goes back and looks at it, so yeah, that really did happen.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So there's the Funkhaus and how it operated. The people that he meets there, his colleagues at the Funkhaus, are all real people who ran it. There was one, Hans Fritzsche is sort of his main contact there, and he was in some ways the Walter Cronkite of Nazi Germany. If anyone remembers who Walter Cronkite was, he was the anchor man, the news anchor man who everyone trusted, the most trusted Nazi in Germany, and really across Europe. People would listen to him to hear sort of what the urbane and intellectual, intelligent justification of what the Nazis were doing was. So reading Hans Fritzsche's newscasts now is sort of a bewildering act because he's advocating terrible things, mass war, among other things. He never advocates for the final solution. They never talk about that on the radio or publicly, where they're murdering 6 million Jewish people and 2 million others. But he does justify this war of aggression in ways that are bewilderingly convincing. He's wrong, but he's very smart. So that's one of them. There's another character that he meets named Melita Maschmann, and I wish that people knew who she was more. She wrote a book called An Account Rendered, which is a memoir. Now, Melita, at the beginning of the Nazi era, was a young teenager, and her parents hated the Nazis. They were right-wing, but they hated Hitler. They thought he was a liar and a creep, which he was. But Melita, sort of as an act of rebellion, decided to become a Nazi. In the early stages of her Nazism, pretty much it sounds like she's describing herself as like making her mom mad for liking the bad guys. But then it evolves. They give her purpose and meaning in her life. And she grows up to do some really, really terrible things. Her job during the war was to get Polish people and Jewish people out of their homes using a German shepherd on a chain and a whip cracked above their head, and they would get on trains to go she did not know where. And she writes a memoir about how she could have evolved to become a Nazi after the war, when she realizes that what she did was wrong. And unlike some people's books, there's a famous book by Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, where he sort of justifies what he did and excuses himself in a really dishonest way. But Maschmann does not excuse herself. She isn't dishonest. She's really trying to wrestle with how she could have done this. And the book is addressed to her former best friend, a Jewish girl, whom she informed on, but whose family escaped Germany. And so reading her book, I think, should be sort of required reading next to the Diary of Anne Frank to understand not just what the Jewish experience was like during the Holocaust, but to understand how a normal teenage girl, could have become a Nazi, because too often we think of Nazis as inhuman monsters. But in fact, they were very human monsters. And to understand how a human could do something so monstrous, people who are just like our neighbors, our friends, our family members, even just like us, is crucial to ensure that we never repeat those mistakes.
The story takes place in a very dark time in our history. But the book itself, people should understand, contains a lot of humor.
Thank you. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. It is supposed to be funny. It is definitely a spy novel, an adventure novel. So while I wrestle with a lot of the darkest topics, also, hopefully it is a page turner, and hopefully you're frequently laughing too. One of the things that I love about writing for young people is that I don't have to just write, a serious historical fiction book or a fantasy or a comedy. For kids, you put it all in the book and they're there for it. And that is just so satisfying for me.
In addition to just being this engaging read, and maybe some educational elements snuck in there about what happened during World War II, what are sort of the overarching themes that you hope that young readers are going to take from the book?
I want people to understand how something like this could have happened. I want people to understand that it didn't happen a long time ago and far away. One of the details that I realized in my research, discovered, was there is a concentration camp near Berlin called Sachsenhausen. And this concentration camp, like all of the concentration camps, would have had a parking lot outside, just like a modern office building or shopping mall. This didn't happen in some remote place, millions of years ago. It is a very modern country, very similar to our own. And I want people to realize that if it could happen there, it can happen anywhere. And even the well-meaning people around us are capable of doing things under the right circumstances that are inhumane. And so we need to guard ourselves, and we need to help guard each other against inhumane activity and against dehumanizing our neighbors, which happens too often and too easily with consequences that are often quite terrible.
In this second book of the duology concludes the story of Max. So what's next for you?
The other thing that I do, in addition to writing books, is I have a podcast for kids called Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest, where I tell grim fairy tales live to kids. I tell the scary versions of the story, the original versions of the stories. Never too scary, but always scary enough that make the kids laugh and scream and things like that, which I love. And the stories are live for kids. So you get to hear not only my stories, you get to hear the children reacting to my stories. So my next book to be published after the Max books is going to be a graphic novel adaptation of some of these grim fairy tales. They are scary and fun, and I cannot wait to share them with the world.
The book is Max in the Land of Lies, A Tale of World War II by Adam Gidwitz. Adam, thank you for talking with me today.
It's always such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
If you'd like to purchase Max in the Land of Lies, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. Well, thank you for watching this edition of the Kids Bookshelf. I'm Dan Skinner. Until next time, keep sharing the gift of reading.